Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today is it's a difficult period. We're losing ground on the arms control front, and I've invited some experts in to tell us what has gone wrong with this treaty-making process, and we're losing some treaties, and one very recently, the New START Treaty. So we will have three expert, knowledgeable people about negotiations for arms control. And our first guest is a man that I've only just met, even though he's been in the business for many years, as the head of the Arms Control Association, which specializes in studying how people try to get rid of things like nuclear weapons, and seem lately to be failing. And Daryl Kimball is is your office in Washington or New York?
We're in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, all right, very good. And in Vienna is Tariq Rauf, who has, I see both Tariq and Paul, mostly in connection with the Canadian branch of the Pugwash movement. And Tariq is in Vienna, where he has worked at various times for the IAEA, and he's a consultant on such matters as arms control today. And in Vancouver is Paul Meyers, who was, I guess when I first met him, the Canadian ambassador for disarmament. So good morning, good afternoon, just barely, gentlemen. And I'm going to ask Daryl, if you will, to start us off and tell us about the events that to which I've been alluding.
Yes, greetings from Washington, D.C. So the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty was negotiated in 2010. It entered into force in 2011. So 15 years have passed since it entered into force. It was the last of a long series of bilateral agreements between the United States and Russia that began in the early 1970s to cap and then later reduce the number of their strategic nuclear arsenals. And New START was important because it cut by about a quarter the number of U.S. and Russian strategic nuclear warheads and the delivery systems, the long-range missiles and bombers from previous levels, and it put into place a more robust set of verification and monitoring provisions. But the treaty expired last week on February 5 without a new agreement or a new framework agreement to supersede it. There are no negotiations going on between the United States and Russia to do so. This leaves us in, I think, a very uncertain period, one in which now the United States and Russia could, in theory, I would strongly advise against it, increase the number of warheads they deploy on their existing missiles and bombers, and there are empty spaces on the intercontinental ballistic missiles, on the bombers. Each side could, if they wanted to, increase by hundreds, if not thousands, roughly doubling their arsenal in the next 2 to 3 years. I don't think that will happen, but that is now a very serious possibility. And one reason why it's a possibility is because Donald Trump, when he announced this, said that rather than continue to respect the limits of New START, we need to negotiate some sort of new modernized treaty that addresses all forms of U.S. and Russian nuclear weapons, not just the long-range ones, and also somehow include China. Now, the problem with this, I mean, it's a worthy goal. It has been a goal for a long time, is that we've heard it all before from Trump. He's now in his 6th year of his presidency. He hasn't accomplished anything with respect to nuclear arms control. In fact, he's done a large number of things that have shaken the foundations of the global nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament system, including threatening to resume nuclear testing. So we will have to see if the United States and Russia get back to the negotiating table. The Russians have said we will continue to respect the central limits of New START, which are 1,550 deployed strategic warheads on no more than 700 deployed long-range missiles and long-range bombers, if the United States does. There's pressure from Congress, from the nuclear weapons establishment, the nuclear weapons deep state, if you will, on Trump to increase the number of deployed U.S. nuclear weapons. Why? Because China, which has a much smaller arsenal of maybe 500, 600 nuclear weapons total, with no more than 200 or 300 on long-range systems right now, they are increasing the size of their arsenal, probably because they want to maintain their own strategic nuclear retaliatory potential against the United States. That's the strange, dangerous logic of nuclear deterrence. And so there are some in the Trump orbit who want him to increase the number of U.S. nuclear weapons to, quote unquote, achieve better, higher degree of deterrence vis-a-vis China. More nuclear weapons aren't going to make us safer. More serious diplomacy to reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons is. So that's where we stand. The only other thing I would add, Meta, is that this isn't just a Donald Trump problem, though Donald Trump has made a lot of things a lot worse in the last just year. But there hasn't been effective disarmament diplomacy in about 15 plus years, right? I mean, the problem dates back. It is a failure of U.S. and Russian leaders, U.S. and Chinese leaders to prioritize this issue. I think it's a failure of middle power states to prioritize nuclear disarmament and nonproliferation in their foreign and military policies, relying too much on the United States to provide the leadership. So we're in a situation now, as Prime Minister Carney noted a couple of weeks ago, where middle powers need to step up, need to speak out for their own self-interest and the interest of the international system, and they need to provide more leadership on pushing the nuclear armed states to fulfill their responsibilities to engage with one another in serious diplomacy to reduce nuclear danger.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. Well, how realistic is it to talk about getting China involved? Because, of course, that would be, in principle, be a good thing. But and I don't understand the logic that even the Chinese have about why the more the better. After a certain point, isn't there such a thing as enough? And that's quite apart from the question of modernization and improving the quality of nuclear weapons. But maybe you have some insight into the psyche of people who believe that the number that you count is really the important thing.
Well, I'll offer a couple quick answers and then let Tariq and Paul weigh in on some of these questions too. The logic of nuclear deterrence has been for decades that you want to be able to reply to a nuclear attack with a devastating counterattack. And that results in mutual assured destruction, of course, right? And so, but to assure that retaliatory attack, you need to make sure that your forces are not vulnerable to a surprise first strike. So, the United States and Russia have roughly equivalent forces. They're distributed on land, sea, and air. Neither one can knock out the other's nuclear force entirely in a surprise first strike. China, however, has historically had a much smaller arsenal. Historically, they've had, up until the last 7 to 8 years, they've had about 100 long-range missiles, liquid-fueled missiles, which take a while to fuel. And the Chinese are increasingly concerned that this force is vulnerable to a surprise U.S. nuclear or conventional strike. So what they're doing, and this is the logic of the Cold War nuclear deterrence madness, is They're building more intercontinental ballistic missile silos. They're filling these silos with missiles armed with nuclear weapons. And so that's probably one of the main reasons why China is building up the size of its force. Tensions with the U.S. in recent years do not, ease these concerns in China whatsoever. So how likely is it the Chinese might be involved? China has, for the most part, for most of the nuclear age, stood on the sidelines of serious nuclear disarmament diplomacy, mainly because their nuclear force has been smaller. They haven't had a history of direct negotiations with the United States in this issue, as Russia has. But they have participated in multilateral processes like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and they have resisted overtures from Trump since 2020 for a trilateral nuclear arms control negotiation. They say the U.S. and Russia have much larger arsenals. You guys go negotiate further reductions and come back to us when your arsenals are closer to the size of ours. Trump is insisting that China needs to be involved. He hasn't said recently how he wants to involve them, except to say that he wants a multilateral approach. Hasn't presented any plan for what he wants to do. I think it is possible for the United States and Russia to continue to engage in a bilateral fashion to negotiate further reductions in their massive arsenals. And the U.S. and China could begin bilateral talks on nuclear risk reduction and to explore what might be possible on arms control and disarmament. There was a bilateral meeting in 2023 between senior U.S. and Chinese officials that might be tried again. But it's going to be a long road to have a serious negotiation with the Chinese. But they do have a responsibility under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Article 6. They're obligated to engage in good faith negotiations to end the arms race and on disarmament, just like the other nuclear armed members of the NPT. So, we're trying to figure out whether the Trump administration has a serious plan for engaging China, or is it a repeat of their failed 2020 trilateral proposal? We shall see.
Recently, Carney has gone to sort of patch up problems with China, and certainly there are little gestures of friendlier relationship. Does that have any bearing at all on Canada's participation in NATO and the other ways in which we cooperate with U.S. arms policies?
Yeah, well, Meta, let me, first sort of pick up on this obligation. Daryl knows it, and our Prime Minister, clearly stressed that the middle powers, at a time of a lot of, frankly, irresponsible great power action inaction in the nuclear realm, it's essential that middle powers become more active and advocate more consistently for saner approaches to these matters. And I think part of that strategy will be to make better use of existing vehicles, which will be harder for nuclear weapon states to sort of reject. And in that regard, I find it significant. Daryl reminded us that with the conclusion of New START in 2010, we entered a 15-year period of really no serious arms control initiatives. But in the same period, we had the initiation of a new consultation among the 5 nuclear weapon states. And that has continued on an annual basis ever since. And in my mind, that is a natural mechanism for doing more because those 5 states, as already flagged, have a legal obligation to disarm, to cease the arms race and move towards nuclear disarmament. And we have in that framework, which all of them have participated in, none have said no, we're going to stand aloof from this. I think what they need is external pressure from those middle powers in particular to become more insistent that that mechanism is used, not just coming up occasionally with a glossy lexicon of nuclear related terminology, but actually to engage in significant nuclear risk reduction measures and further reductions in constraints in accordance with the NPT obligations that they have taken on, including those formed in the review conferences, and I will call in the ones that were able to agree on outcome documents in 2000 and 2010. You had very specific language about reducing commitments to reduce the saliency of nuclear weapons in the security doctrines and policies of all NPT states. And clearly, they have not honored that commitment. But again, they haven't really been criticized for that failure. So I think part of a solution going forward is a much more consistent advocacy and willingness to critique, including critiquing allies about their failures to live up to the obligations. Mm-hmm. And to remind everyone that nuclear anarchy is a very dangerous state to be in. And we have lost, with the end of the verification provisions of New START, one means of actually keeping count or having a form of accountability about levels. So more uncertainty, more pressure on the nuclear nonproliferation norm. It all spells, frankly, very dire future if we can't pull back from that brink.
Since the New START ended, one of the military people in Canada has proposed that Canada develop its own nuclear arsenal. And I don't think that's got much traction. But what it indicates maybe to me is that you don't really expect or shouldn't expect that energy for reversing the trends could come from within NATO, but maybe from some other body or grouping of powers. Can you say a little bit about Canada's attitudes and whether it's relevant to the changing status of that treaty?
It would be a road to disaster for Canada. Not only do we have this solemn obligation under the NPT as a non-nuclear weapons state to forswear acquiring nuclear weapons, in our current context, look at if the Trump administration is prepared to portray our aluminum and steel exports into the U.S. as constituting a threat to American national security, you can imagine how they would respond to intelligence that Canada was embarking on some sort of covert nuclear weapon program. That is not going to help us safeguard our sovereignty and political independence. So that is not the route to take. We need to reinvest in the diplomacy. I think very much I would extrapolate the Prime Minister Carney's speech very much in that direction. And he talked about the cooperation of middle powers to ensure their own security and well-being and also legitimacy. And I think that, again, points back to respecting international legal obligations, including those that we have under the NPT.
I mean, Canada has been really a leader in the past. We need to recall the December 1945 three-nation declaration by the Prime Ministers of Canada, the United Kingdom, and the President of the United States on nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament. And Canada became the very first country that had, in a sense, the knowledge to make nuclear weapons by being involved in the Manhattan Project and the contribution from Chalk River for providing some of the nuclear material to renounce nuclear weapons. And then we've had important prime ministers like Lester Pearson, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who launched his strategy for suffocation in 1980, following the election of President Reagan at that time. And then under Foreign Minister Lloyd Axworthy in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Canada again was a leader But since then, Canada has disappeared as a middle power on nuclear arms control and disarmament. And it's sort of unfortunate that the opening provided by Prime Minister Carney in his important address at Davos about a rupture and middle powers looking after their own interests has not been internalized by Global Affairs Canada, in my view. We recently had a consultation with civil society, and I just didn't see any glimmer of hope in Global Affairs Canada changing its current position on nuclear arms, on support for NATO, and basically becoming more of a follower rather than a leader and coming up with some new ideas. We have this very important 11th review conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons coming up in April and May. At the moment, it looks like a train wreck, and if that happens, that will be the third successive NPT review conference that would have ended without an agreement on further moving the needle on nuclear disarmament. The last success we had was in 2010. Before that, in 2000, we had a landmark agreement on the so-called 13 practical steps for systematic movement on nuclear disarmament. And that has really been walked back by the nuclear weapon states. And now with this further setback of New START being allowed to expire, and there not being any discourse between Moscow and Washington on a follow-up treaty, is really a bad news. And I sort of go back to the rot starting with the Bush administration of renouncing in 2002 the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which in a sense provided the basis for modern arms control. And the anti-ballistic missile treaty came about as a result of the early discussions between Moscow and Washington from 1969 to 1972 that led to the anti-ballistic missile treaty, to the first arms limitation treaty between the two sides. There was also in 1971 an agreement between the two countries to reduce the risk of the outbreak of nuclear war, the hotline, and so on. So all of that is now gone in the past, so to speak, even though the hotlines are still in operation, so to speak. Here in Vienna, it is really a lot of disarray, particularly over the matter of the nuclear file of Iran. Today, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi met with the Iranian Foreign Minister Arakchi in Geneva. We really don't know very much as to what has happened. The IAEA has been pushing for access to the 3 bombed facilities in Iran that were bombed by Israel and the US in June, in Natanz and in Fordo, and to try to get handle on what has happened to the enriched uranium in Iran, especially 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% that could be bumped up to weapon-grade uranium, where Iran still to have some capacity. There was an agreement reached in Cairo in November of last year, but then the European Union and the United States adopted a resolution finding Iran in non-compliance. So Iran walked away from that sort of a small movement that could have happened after the Cairo agreement for the IAEA to be allowed back. The IAEA is back in Iran, safeguarding the Tehran research reactor and the Bushehr nuclear power plant, but it has not been able to visit the enrichment facility yet. The United States has also become a disruptive actor. They have now, at the General Conference and the board, worked assiduously to strip away any references to gender, to sustainable development goals, and to climate change. So the IAEA last year did not adopt a resolution on safeguards, which is its core business. The IAEA and the US was the only country to vote against the IAEA's resolution in the General Assembly, and also against the resolution supporting the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Mm-hmm. So the Board of Governors here is very badly divided. It's become very politicized. And we really don't see, I don't see much glimmer of hope here for the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference.
You say the Board of Governors or something. Of what? What are you talking about, the IAEA? Or?
Yes. Mm-hmm. The Board of Governors is the executive decision-making body of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And that board in the past used to be united on proliferation issues like Iran, North Korea, Syria. But that has eroded away now, and the confrontation over the war in Ukraine, over the occupation of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, over the Iranian nuclear program, has completely stripped away any unity or commonality. And most of the board of governors, I really call them technically incompetent. They really don't understand the issues relating to the business that they're supposed to follow as governors of the International Atomic Energy Agency, to have more of a technical bent, to look at the issues more seriously, rather than the IAEA also becoming a talk shop like the General Assembly in New York. So I'll conclude by saying that, if at this upcoming NPT review conference we don't get some form of an outcome document, we will be I think, in worse trouble. And there is a false narrative that is being perpetrated that we do not need an outcome document at an NPT review conference. To that I reply, well, if that was the case, we wouldn't have had the 64 actions, which include 22 actions on disarmament coming from 2010, the 13 practical steps of systematic efforts to nuclear disarmament coming from the 2000 NPT review conference. We would have nothing. So we need to push back against this. And I'm really glad that Daryl's very small but very important outfit in Washington is really a lone voice. Most of the big think tanks in Washington get a lot of funding from the defense industry and the deep state, and they're all calling for rearmament. No extent. I mean, not in a sense moving on the path that was set by the New START Treaty to try to for the U.S. to balance China and Russia together. And on the website of the Arms Control Association, which Daryl heads, there's a very good assessment countering all of these points. And maybe Daryl could talk a little bit about that.
I mean, one of the consequences of the expiration when you start without a new agreement, new constraints on the U.S. and Russia, is the debate that has been going on, simmering in the background for the last 2, 3, 4 years about a potential increase in the size of the U.S. arsenal is going to accelerate. We have people in Congress, and there was a commission that Congress established that put out a report 2 years ago that is calling for the United States to augment our already massive program to modernize the existing U.S. nuclear arsenal, the delivery systems, the refurbishing the warheads, et cetera, and adding to it in terms of not just the number of nuclear warheads on these systems, but also new systems. And the argument, rests on, I think, a very simplistic and outdated notion that, more nuclear weapons provide more nuclear deterrence. The United States and Russia have, as we have this nice little conversation right now, they have about 1,600 to 1,700 nuclear warheads on systems that can be ordered to deliver their weapons within hours or at least a couple of days. And that is a massive force. And it's that large in part because the U.S. and Russia are seeking to be able to knock out each other's nuclear capabilities. China's force is small, but it is growing. And we just have to ask ourselves the question, how are an additional 250 nuclear warheads on the U.S. arsenal, or 500, or even 1,000, going to change Xi Jinping's calculus in a conflict that might erupt over the Straits of Taiwan in the year 2035? Is he going to be more deterred by the fact that the United States has more nuclear weapons, or does 1,550 nuclear warheads on 700 delivery systems look to be fearsome enough to be able to destroy China's economy, its military capabilities and kill millions of people. I would argue that it's not going to change Xi Jinping's calculus or Vladimir Putin's. What they're going to think about doing if the U.S. increases its arsenal is they're going to match it, not for military reasons, but for political reasons. Putin has adopted for the last several years a policy of what the Russians call reciprocity. If the United States hasn't ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, we're not going to ratify it. If the United States is not complying with this agreement, we're not going to comply with this agreement. If they're not restricted, we're not restricted. So they're going to match U.S. increases, and they can. And China is very likely going to accelerate its nuclear buildup. They're going to see that the U.S. and Russia aren't constrained. They're not going to exercise restraint. They're going to be less willing to agree to, negotiated constraints in some future arms control agreement. So, but there hasn't been serious discussion about this in the Congress, which, of course, is led by Republicans. There have been recently a couple of hearings about the potential for an arms race, but no serious examination of this push that many members of Congress are starting to make, and certainly the defense industry, that the United States needs to begin to upload warheads on its existing missiles. Uploading is adding additional warheads onto existing systems that can carry additional warheads. So we need to, bring this this debate forward. We need to challenge those who want to build up and demand that they explain themselves and reveal what the costs are, answer questions about what the costs of this are, the responses from the other countries. And it needs to be a public debate, because the American public deserves to understand what the consequences of this are. This is not an issue for a few, so-called defense experts to be determining.
Yeah, if I might ask Daryl and Tariq, what about the countervailing forces in society against this nascent nuclear arms race? I'm thinking of the role of the mass media. I'm conscious, we're seeing NPT as this cornerstone, of the nuclear governance regime. And yet, how many times have you read an article on escalation and geopolitical tensions and nuclear proliferation where there's not even a reference to the existing legal regime and the obligations it contains? And then maybe in the aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the nuclear saber rattling, particularly from the Kremlin, I do detect an upsurge in general public awareness of nuclear risks. We have films like House of Dynamite, to remind us about the vulnerability that exists. But also very little discussion of the opportunity costs lost when literally trillions of dollars are already under existing levels of activity going into modernization of nuclear forces, let alone if we get into a full-throated, throttled competition between the nuclear-armed states. So I would like to hear from my colleagues their sense of where can we mobilize some countervailing forces in our respective societies or countries on this question.
Well, that's a good point, Paul. I mean, there is I would say a growing push from various sectors of civil society in the United States against a new nuclear arms race, to halt and reverse a new nuclear arms race. We just published a short issue brief that summarizes some of the things that are happening in civil society. I mean, first and foremost, there's a public opinion poll that was conducted in January of this year, by YouGov that found that 72% of registered voters believe that removing all limits on U.S. and Russian nuclear arsenals would make the U.S. less secure. 87% believe that the U.S. should accept Russia's offer. Putin made an offer to continue to limit both countries' nuclear arsenals for another year. 91% believe the U.S. should negotiate a new deal with Russia to maintain current limits or further reduce both countries' nuclear weapons. That's bipartisan. I mean, at 91%, it has to be bipartisan. So, I mean, if a U.S. president or if a member of Congress were to be advocating for these commonsensical approaches to the nuclear danger, they would have a lot of support. It might not be the decisive issue that, wins them re-election in 2026 or 2028, but the public, the American public has a lot of common sense on these issues. There's also, a growing alliance of organizations that we're working with who have responded to a new call to halt and reverse the arms race that was issued last July. You can find it at reversethearmsrace.org. And right now there are 200 plus organizations, not just U.S. organizations, but globally, ranging from the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, the Peacebuilding Alliance for Peacebuilding, the Arms Control Association, Nuclear Threat Initiative, Friends Committee on National Legislation, many, many others. And there is legislation that has been introduced on the Hill, resolution in the House, resolution in the Senate, that's gaining support. Unfortunately, just Democrats at this point, that calls for the United States to re-engage with Russia, to engage with China on nuclear arms control and disarmament, and to continue to respect the limits that had been set by the New START Treaty and not to increase. So, this issue, the bad thing about New START expiring is that it's gone. The Trump administration does not yet appear to have a coherent strategy for negotiating a new deal. But people are much more aware of this problem. We're having a conversation. We need to expand the conversation and bring, more people and more constituencies into the conversation.
But Meta and Daryl and Paul, but in the Western countries and NATO, they're all falling over each other to increase defense spending. I was just listening to a program where even little New Zealand is wanting to increase its defense spending because they feel that they are living in a perilous world. And so the defense industrial complex has way more money to buy elections, to support candidates for their re-election, and to influence the media. When I listen to the BBC and CNN, which are the two English channels that I get here in Vienna, I see many of the programs angling on the U.S. should attack Iran, what are the options, how it could attack Iran, and so on. I don't see any voices for peace or restraint in the mainstream media, generally speaking. Although in the New York Times and some others, they have managed to put some articles out there on the brink. And there's one young journalist, I think his name is Bill Hennigan, who's been writing about the dangers of nuclear war. And then there are the specialized publications like the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and Daryl's own Arms Control Today. But how many people read that, and what is the reach of that? And I think it's the countervailing arguments for more defense spending, for more nuclear weapons, drowns out these small but powerful voices. I mean, Pugwash held its big conference in Hiroshima last year. They issued a document, but I really don't see any pickup of that in the mainstream media. And so this is a big ongoing challenge for us to find our space in there.
For 30 years or 40, however long, every time you do an international poll about nuclear war weapons, every country, the majority of them, I think in every single poll I've ever heard, with the exception one time in Israel and one time in Pakistan, every country, the majority of people want disarmament, but it has no political impact. I mean, that's what I don't understand. Why don't politicians take that into account. Somehow the public, even though they have a particular orientation and belief system, it doesn't carry through in terms of where they vote or what they do about things.
This is the challenge that many of us who work in the public policy advocacy space, organizing space, have been struggling with, and it is not unique to those of us who want to see less defense spending, less militarism, fewer nuclear weapons. You're right, Tariq. I don't disagree. I mean, but we need to understand, what are some of the reasons behind this in this moment. I would just add a couple of other things. The middle power states, U.S. allies right now, defense spending is a major topic, not because of China necessarily, not just because of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, but because the Trump administration has taken a wrecking ball, not just to international law, but to our longstanding alliances. And so, there is, and even more than that, I mean, threatening certain allies to take over their territory like Greenland. And so, that is creating enormous shockwaves, and it is understandable that, many governments are recognizing that they can't rely upon the United States as a economic, political, or military partner in their defense. And so that's one issue. So one question for all of us is, how long does that last? Is that a permanent condition or not? I hope it is not a permanent condition. Donald Trump is an old guy, and eventually he's not going to be on the scene. We'll see how much longer this Trumpism lasts. But the other factor that we're facing also from Trump is that the news media, which is becoming increasingly, under duress itself because of how the major tech companies have shifted all of our eyeballs to online sources, free sources, major newspapers, major news outlets, losing revenue, and they're shedding reporters. I mean, the Washington Post just offloaded 1/3 of its staff. Okay, so reporters who I talk to on a regular basis, these guys and gals are increasingly, being asked to cover more issues. They're less experts in general. They have less time to cover important stuff. And Donald Trump's modus operandi is to dominate the news cycle with every, major and minor and stupid thing he can think of. So, that means that these are some of the other reasons why the public is not paying sufficient attention, and policymakers who their attention is driven by headlines too, they're not paying enough attention. But, I think, we need to take some heart and solace in recognizing that, as in the past, it has been major social movements who have moved governments to take meaningful action on nuclear arms control and disarmament. The end of nuclear testing, the nuclear freeze movement in the 80s, and more. It's still there, and we need to, as civil society leaders, figure out how we can work together, be more creative, be more connected with other social and political movements who are suffering from similar problems, who share similar values across borders. So, that's one thing we're trying to do, even as a small, think and do tank here in Washington. And I think all of us need to think about, how we can shift attention and move attention on this issue at this. This is a monumental moment in the long arc of nuclear history. We may be facing a new and unconstrained three-way, not a two-way nuclear arms race for the next 5, 10, 15 years. And we have a moment here when we can try to head that off.
But Daryl, our problem is that our side, we have so little money. I mean, in the US, at least, you are lucky that there are some foundations who provide money, but here in Europe,
that is another. I agree.
Yeah,
That is another
I pay
problem
for myself to go to the NPT, and this time, if I go, it's going to cost $15,000 out of one's own pocket. Whereas you have other think tanks who are very well funded, who are making the other argument of more nuclear weapons, this so-called three-body problem, rethinking deterrence, and so on. The labs are funding brand new PhDs who are coming out, wearing the cloak of deterrence. In my country, Canada, there's hardly any funding for the arms control side, whereas the Defense Department still funds in all 10 provinces. Every time we have this consultation with our colleagues in the Foreign Ministry, they plead that they have no money at all. So this is a real problem on our part. And generally, civil society, we work off peanuts. So it's our commitment to the cause that keeps us going. And we're not doing it for the money, but still, you need money to travel. You need money to live. For a lot of the civil society people, I really admire them, the sacrifices that they make at the personal level.
Yeah.
Tariq, I wonder, you talk about, of course, the upsurge in defense spending, including in Canada. I mean, what do you see as the prospect of convincing the powers that be that arms control and disarmament also serves the national security interests? And I recall, and you were personally involved, at one point in Canada, we had a Canadian Centre for Arms Control and Disarmament that did the professional research into these issues and generated recommendations for consideration. And it strikes me that that would be a very worthwhile and indeed a very small percentage of any increased spending by our National Defense Department if that sort of entity was revived in some form or the other.
Yeah, so the center that Paul was referring to, I used to work there, and 50% of our money used to come from then External Affairs and International Trade Canada. And to their credit, they never used their funding to influence what the Canadian Center said, even though some of our positions were in opposition to the policy of the government of the day, such as acquiring nuclear-powered submarines and so on. Part of the problem is that, when I look at the European consortium, it funds 4 big institutions, but they also have to bow in the direction of where the money is coming, and disarmament really still gets a short shrift over there. And I really don't see any space at the moment in the Canadian bureaucracy to get more money out of them, as we were warned that there would be even less money here. They don't include civil society on Canadian delegations. I was on your delegation with which you were heading when you were ambassador for disarmament. I came with you to Vienna for the very first Article 14 conference of the CTBT, and so on. So those times are gone.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask too, do you think there's any room, part of this middle power activism, to get tougher on some of these matters? Like, long thought, we all say we're supporting the nuclear test moratorium and early entry into force of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is one of these kind of slogans repeated endlessly, and yet we have now, what is it, nine states that have prevented the entry into force of that treaty. And it's occurred to me, is this beyond just these kind of ritualized advocacies, wouldn't it be maybe more significant if those countries that had nuclear cooperation agreements with the 9 outliers and just terminated those until such time as they aligned themselves with the clear will of the international community to codify and make fully binding the existing moratorium on nuclear tests. Obviously, we'd have a hard nut to crack with Pyongyang, but I think there is a way of demonstrating beyond, I'd say, just increasingly kind of empty rhetoric to put the courage of our convictions, even if it might mean some sacrifice on the part of the middle powers concerned.
Yeah, this is a point that I've been making. I've in meetings with 2 foreign ministers. I asked them directly to condition their foreign assistance to India, Pakistan, and others They completely refused to do it. And if you remember at the last consultation, I asked Global Affairs, apparently Prime Minister Carney is going to India and is going to sign a 10-year deal to provide uranium to India. But again, there's no demand. Okay, so please sign or ratify the CTBT if you want our uranium. So at the policy level, they're really, they disconnect arms control from economic and broader regional interests. And I'm glad that Daryl and his Arms Control Association really is a stalwart champion promoting the CTBT, and this will be the 30th year of the treaty not entering into force.
I mean, so as you say, Tariq, I mean, it's a challenge to convince foreign ministers, prime ministers to put their money where their mouth is on some of these issues. But there are some things at the in between that I think that can be done, Paul. And I mean, you were at the nexus of this when you were a CD ambassador. I mean, one of the things, for instance, at the NPT review conference is coming up in April, that needs to be done is the non-nuclear weapon states, who are the majority at the review conference, parties to the NPT. They need to, I think, work more closely together on a unified strategy to pressure the P5 on key issues. That hasn't happened in 30 years since the NPT Review and Extension Conference. I mean, that takes leadership at not the prime ministerial level, not even the foreign ministerial level, but at senior levels to recognize the common interests of middle power states. All right, and I think if we translate what Mark Carney said at the Davos meeting, and we look at what that means for nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament, I mean, that means that middle powers like Canada need to work more closely with the South Africas, the Brazils, the Mexicos, the Kazakhstans, the Japans and the Indonesias on a common agenda that's pushing the P5 on a relatively narrow set but extremely important set of issues with a lot of specificity and with one voice and repeatedly. And we just haven't seen that. And so I don't think it requires necessarily cutting off economic cooperation with countries that don't ratify a treaty, although that would be quite useful and satisfying. But there are some things in between, and I can see some of this actually coming together in the next 1 to 2 years.
Daryl, sorry for interrupting. If I'm a foreign service officer, there is no incentive for me to stick my head up, because I will be bashed by the nuclear weapon states and their allies. If the going gets tough, a letter of complaint will go to my foreign minister or to my director, and that affects my career prospects at the end of the day. I mean, I do a lot of courses for diplomats in Vienna, and I'll be going to Hiroshima for the annual course there. And this is part of the problem. And Paul can testify to that, the pressures that he would have been under if he was too active.
I don't disagree, Tariq. I mean, I don't disagree. But what I'm saying is, I don't mean to mythologize Prime Minister Carney, but, he took a risk in making this speech, okay? Yeah. He was standing up and standing out, okay? And if we extend the logic of his speech into the nuclear realm, this is what needs to happen. Okay.
Yeah, I would just note that
that's all I'm saying.
Some Canadian NGOs are in the process of advocacy directed at the Prime Minister, taking, obviously the leverage of his remarks to suggest that Canada show leadership in convening a meeting of the 22 non-nuclear weapon states that are members of the two principal groupings within the NPT review process. That is the Stockholm Initiative for Nuclear Disarmament and the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative.
That's great.
These are cross-regional groupings, and it's exactly this kind of collective strategy forming that may allow them to have more leverage when we actually get to that meeting at the end of April. So very much trying to seize opportunities to stimulate Ottawa for the follow through, which is necessary. And of course, one hopes that there are similar thinking in some of those other capitals of non-nuclear weapon states that have a track record of being more active in their advocacy.
That's great to hear, Paul. But I'd like to learn more about that effort.
What I'm wondering, Paul, is you've been there, and what I wonder is how much did you actually feel that you had to muzzle yourself because you couldn't say what you wanted? I remember talking with Bob Ray when he was at the UN about some sort of human rights issue, and he wasn't allowed, even though he was the ambassador to the UN from Canada, he was not allowed to talk to some Russians, for example. He had to call and get permission. When you were disarmament ambassador, every time you opened your mouth, did you have to clear it with Ottawa first? And exactly what was that process like of getting permission to say what you thought?
Well, fortunately, my time as ambassador for disarmament in Geneva was 2003 to 2007, and for most of it, a government that trusted its diplomatic representatives to ensure that they would stay within the contours of government policy, but that they should be active, seeking initiatives, etc. It was only, dare I say, under the Harper government that there began to be a freeze and this, excessive control, micromanagement, if you will, which was very annoying, frankly, to, seasoned diplomats who quite know how to avoid being openly in contradiction with the government's policy. So, that was there, but. As Tariq alluded to, there were also cases where, seeking alternatives to the deadlock in the Conference of Disarmament, I was part of an initiative with a number of other countries to see if we could recreate the key issues that were all acknowledged as ripe for negotiation via a UN General Assembly resolution, which would not be subject to a veto. And we got pretty far on that initiative, including a draft resolution that we were consulting on in New York just before first committee meeting. And, I get instructions from Ottawa to step away from this. And it was clear that at a senior level of the department, there had been lobbying from the nuclear-armed allies to cease and desist in this effort because they liked the status quo as it was. So that was a little painful to recall, but it was the realpolitik. And what it also underlined, unfortunately, is that even though nothing we did in Geneva was without backing from the Department of External Affairs, Foreign Affairs, as it was at the time, it didn't mean that at the most senior levels of the department or the government that they were necessarily aware or particularly committed to carrying forward these arms control and disarmament objectives. And so that was a reminder that it, as we've already acknowledged, often these very worthy objectives are trumped, pardon the pun, by other considerations in the political, economic, commercial realm. And, that has been a bit of an obstacle all along. But I would say overall, and I definitely respect most of my career, I never felt I was being constrained in what I said. And fortunately, the Canadian governmental positions were positions that I largely would have espoused on my own anyway.
Mm. Okay.
So, Meta, there's also now an effort to get a fourth special session on disarmament, which has been on the books for a long time, to try to reform the disarmament machinery, the decision-making at the Conference on Disarmament, the UN Disarmament Commission, and the First Committee. And generally, the opposition has been from the nuclear weapon states and their allies. who don't want another special session.
Let me back up. You're saying they want to change the, what, let's say the voting rules at the CD? And is that what you're sort of driving at, that they might actually reform how the system works or not?
Well, the CD makes its own rules, but it was set up by the first special session on disarmament, and it will take another special session on disarmament to reform this machinery. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, that's the way the system is set up. And as Paul was mentioning, having stalemate and deadlock in these forums suits the nuclear weapon states and some of their allies. So the Conference on Disarmament hasn't agreed on the new agreement since 1996. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was done outside the Conference on Disarmament by a small group of countries. And here I am in Vienna, Austria, a small little country, neutral country, which is the leader on the TPNW. And its diplomats are constantly harassed by the nuclear weapon states and their allies for their advocacy of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that it undermines the Non-Proliferation Treaty, etc., etc. And I give full credit to my friends at the Austrian Foreign Ministry. It's a very small group who are completely dedicated to this and make a lot of personal sacrifices. But fortunately, there is cross-party support for Austria's positions on nuclear disarmament across the board. So that empowers the diplomats. And this is what one of Paul's former colleagues, the late Ambassador Mark Moher, told me once, that if you want to stand up, you need to clear this with your minister and the deputy minister, so that when the call comes in from a nuclear weapon state or an ally that you please tell your ambassador in Geneva or New York to behave, the minister can say, we have full confidence, as Paul mentioned, in our ambassador in Geneva, and you get your ambassador to talk to them and sort it out, and we don't want to get involved. But there are other politics. Big countries can retaliate in other areas. Yeah. And Canada is very vulnerable for trade, particularly with our southern neighbor. And so that's how the leverage is brought in indirectly. And that's, if you're a political advisor to the foreign minister or the prime minister, that's what affects them. And advisor to one of the Canadian foreign ministers once told me, we agree with what you say, but I want my minister to win the next election and win his seat and not lose it. And he's not going to win his seat on disarmament. He's going to win his seat on jobs.
Yeah. Okay, well, here we are at the end, and I don't like to end without giving some sort of little pithy message to our viewers, who are mostly people like us, or at least their hearts are in the same place. And yet I have no sense of what I want to advise them to do. Where do we put our energies? If you have a slogan, a one sentence statement about where you think activists should put our concentrated energy most to be most effective, here's your chance to say it before I say goodbye. Daryl.
Well, I think it's more nuclear weapons don't make us safer. The United States, Russia, China, the other nuclear armed states need to engage in disarmament diplomacy again. And all governments, be they in North America, South America, Asia, Africa, the Pacific, need to be calling upon them to fulfill that responsibility and to preserve the existing rules against nuclear weapons, specifically maintaining the global ban on nuclear test explosion.
Thank you.
There used to be this old Canadian mantra, of restoring civility and habits of dialogue. We need to talk to our adversaries in order to resolve our problems. But if we regard talking to our adversaries, especially on nuclear weapons, as a reward to them, then we end up in the situation that we are in today. So unfortunately, President Obama was not able to deliver on his Prague speech other than the New START agreement. President Biden wasted his time. He didn't get any progress on ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. He didn't start a new dialogue with Russia on something that would follow New START. Granted that there was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but still.
Paul, you got the last word.
Well, I just would note that at least in democracies, politicians are still sensitive to public opinion. And it doesn't take much a letter to the editor, a communication with a member of parliament, just that there's some expression of concern over this very dangerous path that we seem to be, in a sense, sleepwalking to our own collective disaster. And I think that would be, a healthy and manageable action that your ordinary Jane and Joe could do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I feel energized. I'm going to go out and fight harder. So thank you very much, all of you. And it's great to know that there's some folks like that, like you, still working, plugging along, despite what looks like a kind of a bleak period. So onward, and thank you very much, and have a great day.